Okay, welcome to this week's Contemporary Halacha Shir. And the question is, can a Kohen go to the Natural History Museum? So for those of you who are not familiar with the Natural History Museum here in London, this is a big question of whether you have, you have the Egypt section and you have mummies who are on display in the Natural History Museum. And the question is, can a Kohen go to that? Why are we discussing that this week? Because it's connected to this week's Sedra, Parshas Chukas. The Pasuk says, Zois Teres HaAdam, Zois HaTeres, Adam Kiyomas Ba'ehel, Kol HaBo'el O'el, V'chol HaSher Bo'el, Yitzma Shivas Yomim. That these, the halachas related to Tumah, that your Kohen is not allowed to go into a room where there is a mace. And therefore, that's the question about going into the Natural History Museum where there is a mummy or there is a mace, and what are the halachas? And I give credit to Rabbi Daniel Rosler, whose fabulous websites and shiurim have been an enormous help to me. And this shir is largely based on a shir that he gave, which is on his website. Now, so the nowadays, if you look at the sheet, if you're listening online, please email me at j.golker@gmail.com. I'll send you the handout. Nowadays, this is really only relevant to Kohanim because, sadly, we have not got a Beis Hamikdash, and for the vast majority of us non-Kohanim, we can become Tomei. We can go into the room as the same room as a mace. We sadly do. On occasion, we will go visit a hospital, even though we know there are mason in the hospital, and therefore this really is a shaila for Kohanim nowadays. But of course, Mr. Hashem, when Mashiach comes, this could be relevant to all of us. Now, the question really is: does the concept of Tumas Ohel apply to a non-Jewish mace? That's really the question. So you go to the Natural History Museum and you see a mummified Egyptian who is, of course, not Jewish. And again, al pi rov, the people you're going to deal with are not Jewish if you go to these museums. If they're a Jewish mace, then it's a different shaila. But the question is, does Tumas Ohel apply to a non-Jewish mace? So take a look at the Gemara in Yevamos, second box. The Gemara in Yevamos says, Rav Shimon ben Yochai Omer, Kivrei ovdei kechavim einon metamein ba'ohel. Rav Shimon ben Yochai is of the opinion that non-Jewish corpses are not metamei in an ohel. Shenemar va'aten tzoini marisi odom atem. Atem kurim odom ve'in ovdei kechavim kurim odom. That's a famous drasha, and actually this drasha of atem kurim odom, that you are called a human, a human being. And therefore, when the pasuk says Zois HaTorah Adam Kiyomas Ba'el, it's referring to a Jewish person and not a non-Jewish person. This, by the way, famously, not to be misunderstood, but this Gemara came up in the famous trial of Mendel Bilas. Are you familiar with that? So you heard of Mendel Bilas? Mendel Bilas was a celebrated case, a very sad case, at the beginning of the 1900s, where a Jewish person was accused of a crime, of murder. And it was trumped up charges, and it became a very big case. And the lawyer defending Mendel Bilas was very worried. He was worried that the prosecutors are going to come along and pick out all types of Gemaras which seemed to be negative about non-Jewish people, and say, look, they don't treat non-Jewish people in the same way, and therefore murder is condoned. And he went to the great Ramesh Shapiro. And he said, how shall I defend this particular Gemara? This Gemara I just read, that Atem Kriyim Odom ve'ein ovdei kechavim Kriyim Odom. That could be ammunition for them. How do I interpret it? So Ramesh Shapiro famously said the following. He said, if a Jew here in London hears that a fellow Jew in Argentina, or in Australia, or in New York, or in Europe, or in Eretz Yisrael, is having some sort of difficulty, then you're in pain. We've experienced this in recent weeks. Achenu b'nei Eretz Yisrael have been through very traumatic experiences. We feel it, and we hear a situation where there was an attack in a certain place. We feel it, but in the non-Jewish world, if I hear of something going in another part of the world, I haven't got that same connection. And the point is that Atem Kriyim Odom, that you are like one entity. And therefore, if you knock your left hand, your right hand feels the pain. Your whole body feels the pain. You're like one entity. That's what it means. There's a connection. Atem Kriyim Odom ve'ein ovdei kechavim Kriyim Odom. That's how Ramesh Shapiro told him to explain it in that court case of Mendel Bilas. Okay, now carrying on. The Mishnah says in Arlis, so Rav Shimon Yochai is of the opinion that a non-Jewish corpse is not Matameh Ba'ohel. However, Rav Shimon Gamliel is of the opinion that it is. How so? Because Rav Shimon Gamliel Omer, this is a Mishnah at the end of Arlis in Perek Yud Ches, Ir Ovdei Kechavim Shecharvo Ein Ba Mishum Mother of the Kechavim. If a non-Jewish town has been destroyed, then it hasn't got the status of a mother of the Kechavim. What does that mean? So the Bartanur explains as follows: Ir Nachrim Shecharva, Ari Eretz Yisrael Shedar Ba Nachrim V'Charva Min HaNachrim. If you've got a village, a town of non-Jewish people living in Eretz Yisrael, which has been destroyed, Ein bohem mishum mother of the kechavim. What does that mean? Shechayas mitzuyas sham u'mitzias kol nefelim v'nikvur sham. Because normally, if they have a nefel means a stillbirth or some sort of miscarriage. A woman, Nerachon son, has a miscarriage, and you take the nefel, a child who has not developed fully, and you bury the child there, then that could be matame. But there ain't shechayas mitzuyas sham. But if you've got animals there who are going to dig up the anything that was buried, then there's no concern. So you see that the reason why there's no tumah over there is because animals are going to come along and dig up and eat and anything that was buried there. But if they didn't, if there were no chayas there, then there'd be a problem of tumah. So you see that Rav Shimon ben Gamliel is of the opinion that an ovet kechavim is matameh. So you see there's a machlokas tanoim whether or not there is tumas oihel with a non-Jewish mace. Reb Shimon ben Yochai says it's not metameh, and Reb Shimon Gamliel says it is metameh. How do we pasken? So the Rambam in Hilchos Tumas Mace, Perek Aleph Halachah Gimel says, Ein ha'akum metameh bo'ohel v'dov zeh kabbalah, and this is a Kabbalah who is considered the Masorah that we have, that Ein ha'akum metameh. So the Rambam paskens like Reb Shimon ben Yochai that a mace is not a mace of an akum is not metameh. However, Tosfos argues in paskens like Reb Shimon ben Gamliel. So what does the Shulchan Aruch do? The Shulchan Aruch says in Yeridei and Hilchos Avedas in Siman Shin Ayin Beis Sif Beis, Kivrei Ovdei Kechavim Nochen Lizaheh HaKohen Mileilech Aleihem. Now I get this question from time to time. You're on a trip, you're on a walking tour, and you want to cut through a graveyard or something like that of a non-Jewish graveyard. Is the Kohen on the trip allowed to do that? Says the Shulchan Aruch, Kivrei Ovdei Kechavim Nochen Lizaheh HaKohen Mileilech Aleihem, quoting the Maharam and quoting Tosfos. Now we understand why. So the Shulchan Aruch quotes Tosfos and says, Nochen lizaheh, it's better to avoid a Kohen going through a non-Jewish graveyard. Afal pisha yesh me'akilin, who is that? The Rambam. So even though there are those who are makel the Rambam because he passes like Rav Shimon ben Yochai that Novi Kechavim is not metameh, nonetheless says the Mechaber, Nochen lizaheh, to take on board the shitta of Tosfos, who passes like Rav Shimon Gamliel, that it is metameh. What does the Ramah say? V'nochen lahachmir, and it's better to be machmir avol kevish al mumar metameh k'shel Yisrael. If a Jewish person who's gone off deserted his religion, he's definitely still metameh like a regular Yisrael. So what would we tell this young Kohen? We would tell him to walk around the graveyard and not to go through it, because the Mechaber and the Ramah both say Nochen lizaheh v'nochen lahachmir. Okay, now the Achronim and say, therefore, in normative circumstances one should be strict, but there is room for leniency in extenuating circumstances. Now, what were the extenuating circumstances? So this is the question that came up. Fascinating question. You've heard of skeletons in the cupboard. So this was a case of literally a skeleton in the cupboard. What happened was there was a person who was a medical student, and he had a skeleton in his cupboard for medical purposes, and it was in a block of flats. And there was a Jewish person who came to the Rav and said that he came to the Rav, and the Rav said that this kid's got a problem. What was that particular problem? The problem was that in that block, in somebody else's house, there was a medical student who had a skeleton in the cupboard. So if you think about it, in Tumas Oil terms, the entire block is now a problem. Just like you can't go into the Royal Free Hospital if you know there is a mace there, so too, you can't go into a block of flats if in one of the flats there is going to be a mace. And this is a mace who's long dead, there's a real skeleton in his cupboard. So is this Kohen allowed to live in a block of flats where in another flat there is a medical student who has a skeleton in his cupboard? That was the shaila that came up. So the Dogel Mervava says the following. Now this is very interesting. The Dogel Mervava says, L'dais ha'Raivet, according to the shitta of the Raivet, Palig dehecheshe kvar tomei shuv ein muzal atuma. There's a famous shitta of the Raivet. The Raivet says that the only issa for a Kohen to become tomei again is if he is right now tahar. But if he is right now Tomei, then to become Tomei a second time is not a problem. Okay? Shuv eina muza ala tuma. Imkein, kohanim bizman hazeh ein muzarin ala tuma. Even kohanim, who of course keep away from tuma nowadays, they are Tomei. They've been in a room where there's a mace. That's just the inevitability of life nowadays. Even though we don't pasken like this rivet, mikol makom b'meis goy ikas fake sveika. Why? Geschmack. Because shema kaimelon karayvet, maybe we pasken like the rivet who says that if you're already tomei, there is no further issa to become tomei again. V'im timtzulem edeloi karayvet, and even if we pasken not like the rivet, mikol makom shema goy ein matami ba'el. Because maybe we pasken like Rav Shimon ben Yochai, like the Rambam paskens, that it's not matame. So there's a fake sfeika why there should be a leniency. And it could be, or maybe the Rambam, the Ravid says that mitzad issa there still is, you just don't get malchus. Okay. Now the Pischei Tshuva quotes this Dogel Mervava, the Noda B'Yehuda, shekos v'ledas ha'rayved, deheche shekva tomei shuv ein muza ala tumei im kein kohan mizman hazeh ein muzarim ala tumei v'after lekamilin ka'rayved mikol mokum v'meisavet kechovim ikas fek sveika v'lochein niner anivestaiti demisha reis lismich v'zel hakel in tumas oel ein moichin biyodei. And therefore, there would be room for leniency in certain situations based on the sveika of the Dogel Mervava. Number one, that we may be passing like the Rayved, that the only issa is if the guy is tahor right now, but if he's already tomei, there's no issa to become tomei again. And second of all, maybe we pasken like the Rambam, like who pasken like Shimon ben Yochai, that a non-Jewish person is not matame. Fine. The similar question came up with the Avnei Nezer. The Avnei Nezer had a situation where a question came to him of a Kohen who on Yom Tov was going into a house, and in that house there's somewhere in that block of flats, in that apartment building, there was some sort of mace. It's hard to see from the question exactly the structure of the setup, but either way it was that sort of situation. And the Avnei Nezer says essentially there were three reasons to be lenient. What were the reasons? Number one, if if the mace is in a different room, then the tum is only midrabanan. That means, let's say you've got a block of flats. And in flat number one, even in the same flat, if you've got a mace in the bedroom, and then you're in the living room, there is an opinion, the Shach brings this, that it's your own, the Tumah D'Oraisa is only if you're in the same room as the mace. If you're in a different room, even though you're under the same oil, then that is only a Tumah D'Rabbanan. If you take a look at the Shach, in the bottom box there, it says, V'davke mu b'oil ha-meis, nir davke nokat b'oil ha-meis, aval im b'batim ha-smuchim l'ba'esh ha-meis b'soichai. You're in, sometimes you see in, like Gateshead, for example, you've got many streets with terraced houses. So you've got a problem there. Because if they're all connected, there's no tefach in between any of the houses. If there's a mace in one of the houses, then the whole terrace could be a problem. But according to the Shach, it would only be a problem d'Rabbanan, because the Tumah D'Oraisa is only if you're in the actual house where the mace is there. So one sniff to be matir is the Shach, who says that it's only a Tumah D'Rabbanan if it's not in the actual room where the mace is. Number two reason to be matir is because of the Ravid, the famous shita of the Ravid, that the only issa is if the Kohen is currently tahor. But if he's already tomei, which all our Kohenim nowadays will be, then to become tomei again is only an issa drab, is not asa. Sorry, is not asa according to the Ravid. And third of all, maybe the halach is like the Rambam, that's an akum is einem tomei anyway. So in situations in extenuating circumstances, for example, where the case with the Avnei Nezer, the Kohen couldn't leave his house on Yom Tov, because if he's him leaving his house, he's going to come into another courtyard where there is a mace, non-Jewish mace there, then there is certainly grounds to be matir. And so too with this young man, if he's living in a house, what are you going to ask him to do? To set up and to move out of his house? It's going to be quite difficult for him. So are there grounds for leniency in extenuating circumstances? The answer is yes. But what would that mean in terms of the Kohen going to the Natural History Museum? And if it's all one building, is that extenuating circumstances that he can't go on this school trip? So the answer is probably not. And therefore he shouldn't go on it. So it depends really what the situation is. Is there room for leniency? Then possibly. So let's just summarize very quickly. We've discussed the topic of a Kohen going to the Natural History Museum or being Matame Lemeis for a non-Jewish mace. It's connected to this week's Sedra because this week's Parashah Chukas says Zois HaTorah Adam Kiyamos Ba'Ohel, which is relevant, of course, nowadays to Kohanim, but please God, it'll be relevant to all of us in Mitzvah Hashem when Mashiach comes. Does Tumas Oil apply to non-Jewish mace as well? So according to Rav Shimon Yochai in the Gemara in Yevamos HaMachalef, it does not, an oil of a non-Jewish person is not matame. According to Rav Shimon Gamliel, based on the Mishnah in Oilis, it is matame. The Rambam paskins Rav Shimon Yochai that it's not matame. Tosei have a paskins Rav Shimon Gamliel that it is matame. The Shulchan Aruch says nochen lizoher. The Kohen should avoid going to a non-Jewish graveyard, to being matame for a non-Jewish person. The Ramah also says nochen lahachmin. Achronim say that in normative circumstances one should be strict. However, there would be room for leniency. And the room for leniency, as we've discussed, is a situation when this medical student had a skeleton in the cupboard and there is a Kohen who wants to go to another part of the building. He wants to access his own flat in this apartment building, or in the case of a Kohen have to relocate for Yom Tov, where he would not be able to get out of his flat because it seems to pass through another place, which would be Tomei. So in those situations, there are grounds to be matir. The three sfeikas would be, number one, that if the mace is in a different room, it's only by a tumah drabanan. Number two, perhaps the locha is like the Raivad is described. And number three, perhaps the locha is like the Rambam. In any event, tumas of a non-Jewish person is not matame anyway. So, therefore, in extenuating circumstances, there may well be room to be lenient, but normatively, one should try and avoid it. Okay, Peseda.